Hi again, everybody. One last time. This will be the final lecture in our course, and I'm going to try, at least, not to make it a long one. We've been through a lot of those over the last 13 weeks, and I certainly want to thank all of you for turning in and paying attention and participating in the stuff that we have been learning about together. As you know, we in this course have been looking at our very old, very canonical, very difficult literary texts under a heading of the topic of recognition. That has been our theme, that has been our subject matter. That's what we have been trying to learn some things about in our course. And you've heard me talk about that concept of recognition a lot in these lectures. So I'm not going to go over all of that stuff again, except to offer a couple of closing or final metaphors for recognition, that sudden and to a large extent involuntary experience of seeing or grasping, through which and by which we come to know anything that we come to know. A couple of closing metaphors. One, what's recognition like? Well, it's like a light going on, right? And it seems that we cannot quite make that light of recognition go on. What we can do is wait for it and look for it and hope for it to go on. But that light going on, that's what recognition is like, I think. And once the light is on, it's on. You may be able to turn the light off again, but you probably won't be able to unsee what you saw while it was on. So a light going on suddenly in a way that is somewhat beyond our control. A light that we need to go on if we are to learn anything or know anything. And a light that allows or even compels a sudden seeing, even if it may be a sudden seeing of things we did not necessarily want to see. Now, when we started our look at Swift a couple of weeks ago, I did a kind of partial review of the work we've done in the course, the texts we've looked at in the course under the heading of recognition. And that review took us up to Swift. Oh, this was in lecture 19, I believe the number was. And I want to review that review and then take it to the next stage because, of course, I didn't at that time explain really how Swift fits into our course or what the significance of Gulliver's Travels is in our course on the phenomenon of recognition. So, again, if we put our texts in historical order, starting with the Odyssey, then, as I said a few weeks ago, in the Odyssey, in Homer, it seems that we are looking at a text in which Homer, whoever he is trying, as it were, to come up with or make sense of the very notion of recognition, that light turning on, that sudden seeing, that shock of knowledge. Homer seemingly, again, is trying to grapple with, as though it's a kind of new or strange idea to him and to his society and culture, the very notion that there needs to be such a moment, such an involuntary moment of recognition if we are to know and if we are to be known as Odysseus wants to be known in that epic poem. In Sophocles, then, taking it up to the next stage historically, in Sophocles, in Oedipus the King, we, as audience members of that tragedy, we are watching that light go on, that tragic anagnorisis occurring on the stage. We, as the audience, are waiting for that to happen. We are wanting that to happen, willing that to happen, even though at the same time we are terrified about the prospect of that recognition happening because that blazing light of recognition, as Sophocles teaches us, may be so bright that it can actually leave blindness in its wake. In King Lear, then, the next stage of our course, and as I argued a couple of weeks ago, in King Lear, Shakespeare's turning that light of recognition around. It's not just us watching the play in King Lear. It's also, and maybe more importantly, the play watching us. Shakespeare's calling upon us to grasp, to know, to accept, to understand. That we have to expose ourselves to the challenge of recognition. We have to be prepared to go through what the characters on the stage go through. Indeed, in a way, what Oedipus went through back in Sophocles, in the sense that we have to be prepared to lose it in order to get it. And in Shakespeare, I think this imperative that he's calling us to, it's partly, let's say, epistemological, which means it has to do with the nature of knowledge and of what it is to know. But it's also partly, and I think more importantly for Shakespeare, a moral imperative, a moral call that his play makes when it calls us to the challenge of recognition. That's Lear's imperative, that he yells at us from the stage in various ways with that command, attend, at the beginning of the play, and the command break at the end, or as Lear also puts it in that final scene, howl, 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 howl. That's the imperative, I think, that Shakespeare directs at us through that incredible tragedy. And then, as I asked but didn't answer a few weeks ago, what about Swift? What's his part in all this? Where does Gulliver's Travels fit in this story of the development of the theme of recognition that I've been trying to tell over the last 13 weeks? Well, I think it's pretty evident that Gulliver's Travels is a kind of nightmare of recognition, an extended nightmare of the failure of recognition to happen. Gulliver, let's say, is an absolute genius of not getting it, not seeing, failing somehow to allow that light to go on. He's constantly finding his way into situations of humiliation and absurdity without recognizing that's what they are, without getting it, without grasping it. Even when Gulliver thinks he is really getting it, and precisely when Gulliver thinks he is really getting it, then most disastrously he is failing to get it. So again, he's a genius of failure under our theme. He's the anti-recognizer, something like that. And where that leads him, of course, as we saw in the end in Gulliver's Travels, is to the astonishingly, brilliantly absurd situation in Gulliver's Travels, Part 4, I mean, where Gulliver lives as the slave of a horse, living himself in a grotesque little hovel while thinking he's really found the perfect form of human existence. So, recognition. Where is recognition in Gulliver's Travels? Well, nowhere. Recognition precisely doesn't occur in Gulliver's Travels. Rather, Swift wants it to be the case that recognition occurs Gulliver's Travels. We, the readers of Swift's satire, are called upon by him to take on the challenge ourselves of figuring out, noticing what makes sense and what does not, what is to be got and what is not to be got in and out of Swift's enormously rich and complex and long satires. So Gulliver, as I said a moment ago, he is a virtuosic anti-recognizer. We, the readers of Gulliver's Travels, are called upon by Swift to become recognizers. So it's a little bit like the output of Shakespeare's King Lear. The challenge of recognition is turned over to us, but in Lear, that's a kind of tragic imperative, of course. In Swift, it is rather a satiric imperative. So I suppose we could say that in moving from Shakespeare to Swift under the heading of recognition, we're also moving from the moral to the social and even to the political. Swift hands that light of recognition over to us. He says, here you go, guys. And he wants us to be prepared to train that light of recognition on our own societies. Because if we are not prepared to do that, Swift says, and Swift, I think, is very passionately trying to teach us this. If we are not prepared to be in charge of that light of recognition, if we are not prepared to be the ones who are running that recognition machine, we as individuals, as readers, as thinkers, as citizens, as people, if we're not prepared to do that, Swift is telling us we are in danger. Gulliver's Travels is a satire, obviously, and in many ways, in many places, it is a very funny satire, but it is also, of course, a very, very dark and very, very angry satire. Although I think Swift really is not somebody who wants to, as it were, be overwhelmed by that anger, but I'm not sure that he always succeeds. Swift is trying to tell us that if we're not prepared to become recognizers, if we're not prepared to take charge of that light, that machine, we're in danger of crappy things happening to us, like the very crappy things that happened to Gulliver throughout his miserable and largely self-inflicted life. More importantly, Swift, I think, is trying to tell us we are in danger of participating in some pretty crappy things. Gulliver applauding the genocide of the Yahoos because he is convinced it's consistent with Whinham reason. That's Swift's brilliant, dark masterpiece picture of how bad things can get for us. At the social level, I mean. unless we are prepared to take on the burden and the challenge and the power of satirical liberation, let's say. So that's where it ends. It ends with us in charge of recognition, this slippery, powerful, mysterious, necessary phenomenon, this light. And in the end, that being in charge that we are called to is not only epistemological, although that is a very, very big deal. It's not only moral, although that too is a very, very big deal. It is also social and political, the charge that we wind up with. Now, I said earlier, some weeks ago when we were starting our look at Swift, I said that a society without satire is fairly evidently, I think, either an unfree society or it is a society that is in danger of becoming unfree. That is to say, a society in which there's all kinds of things that you're not allowed to make fun of, and perhaps even all kinds of things that you're not allowed to talk about. And you know what they are, which is why you know not to talk about them. That's clearly oppressive. That's silencing. That's a kind of hand over your mouth in that kind of society. So if we look around in any given society and we say to ourselves in surveying such a society, if we find ourselves saying, hey, I don't think there's really any real satire in this society. I can't actually imagine how there could be satire even in this society. If we're saying that about any given society, that's a very bad sign because it means, again, that the society is either in danger of becoming unfree or in fact has already become unfree. That's, so to speak, the bad news. There is some good news, but it's, I suppose, ironic good news. Maybe that's appropriate to our closing notes, satire in our course. The good news is a society without satire is obviously, and by exactly that token, a society that stands in need of satire, real satire. There's lots of opportunity for satire in that kind of society, lots of material to be satirized in that kind of society. It's just a question of whether anybody's out there who is brave enough and I suppose smart enough to be and act like a Swift rather than a Gulliver. So I want to close this final brief lecture and our whole course by glancing back at King Lear, and at scene 1 of King Lear, which we spent quite a bit of time on. That incredible scene of both family and political drama in which, as you guys will recall, Lear calls upon his daughters to tell him how much they love him in order to receive the sumptuous reward of a third of the kingdom. So scene 1 of King Lear brings us into a situation, into a conversation, into a performance where certain words must be spoken, certain other words must not be spoken. It is a microcosm of an unfree society. Scene 1 of King Lear. I mean, even perhaps a microcosm of a maximally unfree society. And yet, Shakespeare teaches us something, I think, right there through Cordelia in scene 1 of King Lear, how very easy it is, in principle at least, to respond to the oppression and the silencing of a society like that. In fact, I think Shakespeare is even kind of telling us there that in a sense, and again, this is kind of good news, even though it's ironic good news, in a sense, the more oppressive such a society becomes, the easier it is for there to be a response. Because if, when a King Lear comes to us, surrounded by his power and his pomp, totally confident in his ability to control us, to make us do or not do whatever he wants, and of course also serenely confident in the rightness, in the moral correctness of his ability to compel us in that kind of way. When a King Lear like that comes to us in a situation like the one Shakespeare represents in scene 1 of that play, and asks us, "What can you say?" All we have to do is respond truthfully, nothing.